Do you know that feeling when you're just drowning in articles, reports, data, and all you really want is the distilled essence, like the core nuggets of knowledge that truly matter without getting totally overwhelmed? Well, you've come to the right place. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the fascinating world of business analytics. And it's really not just about crunching numbers, is it? It's more about decoding the hidden messages within that data to
Yeah.
make smarter, more strategic, and yeah, ultimately more profitable decisions.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is really to equip you with a foundational understanding of some really powerful analytical tools. Tools that go way beyond just looking back at history. They help you predict what's likely to happen next. They let you optimize crucial things like pricing and figure out how to allocate your precious resources for, peak performance. We'll definitely go beyond just the definitions. We want to explore the why and the how these techniques actually impact business, helping you cut through all that complexity and maybe get those aha moments, the ones that transform raw information into real actionable insight. So yeah, let's explore this landscape together.
I'm ready. Because so often in business, we're not just looking at what's happening right now, are we? We're kind of squinting into the future. Like, will a customer leave us? Will this new product actually fly? It often boils down to predicting outcomes. And when those outcomes are a clear cut yes or no, well, we need a specialized tool for that. Tell us about that. I mean, you can't just use a simple straight line model if the answer has to be a probability between 0 and 1, can you? Like you said, you can't have a 150% chance of defaulting on a loan.
You've absolutely hit on the core challenge there. And this is precisely where logistic regression comes in. It's really an indispensable predictive tool in these situations. Unlike linear regression, which, as you rightly pointed out, might predict values outside a sensible range, like negative probabilities or ones greater than 1, logistic regression uses this special S-shaped curve. It's known technically as the sigmoid function. The elegance of it really lies in its ability to transform any linear combination of factors, no matter how large or small they add up to, into a probability that just naturally falls between 0 and 1. Think of it as a kind of sophisticated translator, taking these raw input scores and smoothly converting them into a likelihood.
Okay, that S-shaped curve makes intuitive sense for probabilities. It sort of squishes everything into that 0 to 1 range. But how does it actually get to predicting a firm yes or no from that probability curve? And what's this logic transformation you mentioned? It sounds a bit intimidating.
It's a great question, and it's where the mathematical genius really comes in. So the logistic regression model first works by performing what's called a logit transformation. Think of this as, well, a brilliant mathematical trick that essentially stretches out the probability scale. It takes those probabilities, which are confined between 0 and 1, right? And it maps them onto an infinitely wide scale, what we call log odds. Now, this wider unbounded scale is actually much easier for a simple linear model to work with. It lets it capture complex relationships in a linear way. The core formula you often see is log 1p plus v or x plus 0 of s. That log 1p part is the log odds. Once this linear calculation, often just called z, is done, we then squish the result back into a sensible probability between 0 and 1 using that S-shaped sigmoid function again, p equals 1, 1 plus e.
Right, okay. So the coefficients, those beta values, they must be pretty important here then. What do they actually tell us about the factors influencing our prediction?
Oh, they're incredibly informative. The coefficients, those use of values, they reveal the strength and the direction of each factor's influence on the log odds of the positive outcome. So for example, if a coefficient value for a particular factor is, say, zero point 0.7, it means that for a 1-unit increase in that factor, the odds of the positive outcome occurring would roughly double, because E point 0.7 is approximately 2.01. That's actually a pretty common rule of thumb for interpreting these logistic regression coefficients. It gives you a feel for the impact.
Okay, so if we're predicting, say, if an MBA student gets placed, and we look at factors like their academic performance or maybe industry experience, a positive coefficient for those factors would mean higher odds of placement. That gives us a really clear picture of what variables are actually driving that positive outcome.
Precisely. And after getting these probabilities for each individual student or customer or whatever, the next critical step is converting them into a definitive yes or no prediction. We do this by setting a threshold. If the predicted probability is above this threshold, very commonly it's set at zero point 0.5, or 50% we predict yes. That's our positive class. Otherwise we predict no, the negative class. And this threshold, it isn't just some technical parameter. It's really where business strategy starts to intertwine with the math. It determines the model's actual decision-making impact.
Ah, I can see that. So we make a decision based on the model and the threshold. But, in the real world, these decisions come with consequences. What happens if our model says yes to a loan and whoops, the customer defaults? Or, just as bad perhaps, what if it says no to a customer who would have been perfectly creditworthy? That's a lost opportunity. How do we even begin to evaluate the goodness of these kinds of categorical predictions?
You've highlighted the absolute core dilemma there. That's where classification metrics come in. And they all stem from this fundamental tool called the confusion matrix. Just imagine a simple 2x2 table. On one axis, you have the actual status, what truly happened in reality. And on the other axis, you have the predicted status, what our model said would happen. So true positives, TP, are the ideal scenario. Instances where the actual outcome was yes, say the customer did default and our model correctly predicted yes. We caught them. Good. True negatives, TN, are equally good. Instances where the actual outcome was no, the customer did not default, and our model correctly predicted no. We correctly identified a low-risk customer. Also good. Then come the errors, and understanding these is absolutely vital. False positives, FP. These are actual no's that the model predicted as yes. This is often called a type I error. It's like crying wolf. In our loan example, it means we predicted the customer would default, but they actually wouldn't have. We might deny them a loan unnecessarily. That's costly in terms of lost business. False negatives, FN. These are actual yeses that the model predicted as no.
This is a type 2 error. It's like missing a real threat. This is where we predict a customer won't default, but they do. For a bank, this is a direct financial loss, often very costly.
Wow, okay. So the confusion matrix really lays out all those possible prediction outcomes, the good and the bad, in a very clear visual way. That seems like a really powerful framework for understanding performance.
It absolutely is. It's the foundation. And from this matrix, we calculate several key metrics. Accuracy is the simplest one. It's just TP plus TN, total predictions. It tells you the overall proportion of correct predictions, but, and this is a crucial caveat, accuracy can be incredibly misleading if your yes or no groups are very unbalanced. For instance, in that loan scenario, maybe 95% of customers don't default. A really simple, maybe even naive model that just predicts no default for everyone will achieve 95% accuracy. Sounds great on the surface, right? But it would completely miss all the actual defaulters, which is obviously a catastrophic failure for a bank.
That's a really crucial point. High accuracy doesn't always mean a useful model, especially with unbalanced data. So what other metrics do we need to look at then to get a more nuanced view?
Right, that's why we often look at precision and recall. And there's usually a trade-off between these two. Precision is calculated as TP plus FP. It answers the question. Of all the times we predicted yes, how many times were we actually right?
Right.
It focuses on minimizing those false alarms, the false positives. Think about a spam filter. High precision is vital because you really don't want to accidentally send important emails to the spam folder. Or in fraud detection, high precision means fewer legitimate transactions get flagged as fraudulent, avoiding customer annoyance. Then there's recall, which is also sometimes called sensitivity. It's calculated as TP plus FN. This asks a different question. Of all the instances that were actually yes, how many do we correctly identify? Recall focuses on minimizing missed opportunities, the false negatives. In medical diagnosis, for instance, high recall is paramount. You want to catch as many true disease cases as possible, even if it means some false alarms, lower precision. For a bank trying to identify high-risk defaulters, high recall would ensure they don't miss many potential losses, even if they flag some good customers too. We also have specificity, which is TN plus FP. That tells us how well we identify it's the true negative rate. And finally, the F1 score. It's the harmonic mean of precision and recall. It's particularly useful when your classes are imbalanced and you need a single metric that kind of balances the importance of minimizing both false positives and false negatives.
Okay, that gives us a much richer picture than just accuracy. Let's try to put this into action with that real-world scenario from the source material. It described a loan default prediction model. It had an intercept plus 3.2, an age coefficient of -1.7, and an income coefficient of plus 1.4. So just reading that. Higher income apparently increases the odds of defaulting in this model, while higher age decreases it. That seems interesting.
Yes, that's a great observation. And it highlights how models can sometimes uncover non-obvious, maybe even counterintuitive relationships in the data. That's part of their power. So now imagine a specific customer applying for a loan. Let's say they are aged 4.0, which we interpret as 40 years old. Perhaps age is measured in decades in the data. And they have an income of 0.8, which maybe represents 0.8 lakhs per month or 80,000 euro. Our model crunches those numbers behind the scenes using those coefficients. 3.2, 1.7, 4.0 plus 1.4 is 0.8. The underlying score for this customer, that Zubwell value we talked about, turns out to be negative 2.48. Now, the beauty of the sigmoid function is that it takes this raw score and effortlessly transforms it into a probability. In this specific case, a Zubwell of negative 2.48 means this customer has approximately a 7.73% chance of defaulting, according to the model. Now, if our standard decision threshold is 0.5 or 50%, since 7.73% is way less than 50%, we predict this customer will not default. But here's the crucial part. Let's say in reality, this customer actually did default later on. In that case, our model made a false negative error. We missed a defaulter.
And this is a critical insight for the bank, isn't it? Because that false negative directly translates to a loan loss that perhaps could have been avoided if the model had flagged them.
Right. And that threshold choice suddenly becomes a really strategic business decision, not just some technical parameter the data scientist sets, right? It could literally mean the difference between prioritizing, minimizing missed opportunities versus minimizing those false alarms.
Absolutely. The choice of threshold is paramount. It's driven entirely by the business context and the relative costs of making those two types of errors, the false positives and the false negatives. If false negatives are very, very costly, think about missing a critical disease in a medical diagnosis or failing to identify a serious security threat, you would likely choose a lower threshold. This makes the model more sensitive, right? It ensures it catches more potential positives, which increases your recall. The trade-off, though, is that it will likely also increase false positives. More healthy individuals might be incorrectly flagged, or more harmless emails might end up in spam. Conversely, if false positives are the really costly error, like incorrectly flagging legitimate emails as spam all the time, or maybe denying a loan to a highly creditworthy customer who then takes their business elsewhere, or perhaps even incorrectly identifying a high-value customer for an exclusive, expensive offer they don't warrant, then you choose a higher threshold. This increases precision. It makes sure that when your model predicts yes, you're very likely to be right. But the trade-off here is that you might miss some actual yes cases, which lowers your recall. Understanding these trade-offs and quantifying the costs, if possible, is absolutely crucial for the so what of applying these metrics. It's what transforms these data insights into actionable business strategy, aligning the model's performance with the organization's actual risk tolerance and strategic objectives.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So logistic regression is incredibly powerful for those yes-no categorical outcomes. But what if we want to predict a continuous number, like, say, a house price, based on many different features, square footage, number of bedrooms, location, age of the house, etc. We're not looking for a probability between 0 and 1 anymore, but an actual value, like dollars or rupees.
Exactly, and that's where multiple linear regression, MLR, really shines. It's a foundational analytical tool for precisely this kind of prediction. It's essentially an extension of simple linear regression, but it allows us to model the relationship between a single dependent variable, the thing we're trying to predict, like house price and multiple independent variables or features. The model takes that familiar linear form. Y-x's plus A-zeros plus C-zeros plus betas plus null CP. Here, Y is our dependent variable, house price. The x's are our predictor variables, square footage, bedrooms, etc. The metas are the coefficients we're trying to estimate from the data. And epsilon is the error term representing all the unexplained variation or noise that the model doesn't capture.
So those bows is the coefficients. They're telling us how much y changes for each x, right? Like if the bid for square footage is, say, 100, does that mean every extra square foot adds exactly 100 to the predicted price?
That's the core idea, yes. But there's a really crucial nuance here that differentiates MLR from simple linear regression, and it's vital for accurate interpretation. These bases are what we call partial slopes. A partial slope tells you how much y, our house price, is expected to change for a 1-unit increase in a specific x, like square footage, while holding all other x variables in the model constant. That's the key phrase. It isolates the unique contribution of each predictor, accounting for the influence of all the other factors already included in the model. So the coefficient for number of bathrooms tells you the expected change in price for adding one more bathroom, assuming the house's square footage, lot size, age, and all other variables in your model remain unchanged. This makes MLR incredibly powerful for understanding the individual impact of multiple factors simultaneously.
Okay, holding other things constant, that's the key.
Yeah.
So once we've built this model, how do we know if it's actually any good? It's not enough just to get a set of coefficient numbers, right? We need to assess its reliability, its explanatory power.
Precisely. We need to evaluate what we call model fit. How well does a model actually represent the data? The most common measure you'll hear about is R squared. It tells us the proportion of the variation in our dependent variable y that our model explains. It ranges from 0 to 1, or 0% to 100%, with higher values indicating a better fit. So an R of 0.75 would mean that 75% of the variation in house prices in our dataset is explained by the features included in our model: square footage, bedrooms, location, etc., which, would probably be considered quite good in many contexts. However, there's a critical trap with R that you absolutely need to be aware of. R always increases, or at least stays the same, whenever you add more variables to the model. Even if those variables are completely irrelevant or just random noise, this can easily mislead you into building overly complex models that seem to fit the current data well, but don't actually generalize well to new data. They just memorize the noise. And that's exactly why we often prefer using adjusted R squared. This version introduces a penalty for adding unnecessary predictors.
It adjusts the R-squared value based on the number of predictors in the model relative to the number of data points. Adjusted R-squared can actually decrease if you add a new variable that doesn't significantly improve the model's explanatory power beyond what you'd expect by chance. So adjusted R-squared isn't just a minor statistical tweak. You can think of it as your model's conscience, in a way. It actively discourages you from just throwing more and more variables at the problem, hoping for a slightly better fit number. It pushes you towards building leaner, more robust, and more parsimonious models that genuinely explain the underlying variation, not just capitalize on chance correlations in your specific data set. It's often a sign of a more trustworthy model.
That's a really great distinction. R squared versus adjusted R squared. Very useful. But beyond just how much variation the model explains overall, how do we know if our model is, as a whole, is statistically significant? Is it actually better than just guessing the average house price? Or how do we know if the individual predictors like square footage or number of bathrooms are actually meaningful? Are they contributing something real to the prediction, or could their coefficients just be random noise?
Great questions. For the overall model significance, we use the F test. The F statistic basically tests the null hypothesis that all the regression coefficients except the intercept are simultaneously equal to 0. If they were all 0, it would mean our model as a whole has absolutely no predictive power. It's essentially just predicting the average Y value for everyone, regardless of the X values. It's just a flat line. If the calculated F statistic is high and it's associated with a low p-value, typically below a threshold like 0.05, it gives a strong statistical confidence to reject that null hypothesis. It tells us that our model, taken as a whole, is statistically significant and explains a meaningful amount of the variation in Y. It's performing better than chance. Think of it as the overall thumbs up or thumbs down for your entire predictive framework. For instance, in that example from the source with 50 data points and 3 predictors, they calculated an F statistic of 8.52. What's crucial here isn't the exact number 8.52 itself, but understanding that a value like this, if paired with a low p-value, would strongly indicate that the model is indeed performing significantly better than just random guessing. Now, for the individual predictors, we use the t-test for each coefficient. This test tells us if each specific coefficient, like the one for square footage or the one for number of bathrooms, is statistically significantly different from 0. It assesses whether that particular variable truly contributes meaningfully to the prediction after accounting for the presence of all the other variables already in the model. If a predictor's t-statistic is large, either positive or negative, and its associated p-value is low, again, typically below 0.05, then we can be confident that it has a real and reliable impact on Y. This helps us weed out variables that might seem correlated with Y on their own, but don't add unique predictive value once other, better predictors are included. It helps us build a cleaner, more interpretable model.
Okay, so we're not just getting a prediction, we're also gaining a deeper statistical understanding of what drives that prediction and which factors are truly important. But sometimes I hear analysts talk about issues like, multicollinearity. That sounds complicated. How does that affect our interpretation? And how do we even begin to untangle more complex relationships where maybe one factor influences another factor, which then influences the outcome? It's not always a direct line, is it?
You've hit on a critical and actually very common challenge in regression modeling. Multicollinearity happens when 2 or more of your independent variables, or X's, in the model are highly correlated with each other. For example, in our house price model, if you include both square footage and number of rooms as predictors, they're often highly correlated, right? Because larger houses typically have more rooms. When you have high multicollinearity, it becomes incredibly difficult for the model to separate out their individual effects simply because they tend to move together in the data. This can lead to several problems. First, you can get very unstable coefficient estimates. The body values might swing wildly with even small changes in the data, making them unreliable for interpretation. 1 minute square footage seems hugely important, the next minute it doesn't. Second, It often leads to inflated standard errors for those coefficients. This can make individual variables seem statistically insignificant, high p-values on the t-tests, even if they actually are important predictors when considered alone or with different variables.
Imagine trying to figure out which of two identical twins scored a goal when they always celebrate together. It's hard to assign individual credit. We typically detect this using a metric called the variance inflation factor, VIF. A common rule of thumb is that a VIF greater than 10 for a variable indicates severe multicollinearity, suggesting a potential problem that needs addressing. Strategies to deal with it often involve things like removing one of the highly correlated variables, or maybe combining them into a single index variable, if that makes sense. But even with these potential issues, MLR can still offer incredibly powerful insights, especially when we move beyond just looking at the direct coefficients and start thinking about path analysis. This is where we can map out and quantify not just the direct effects, the straightforward arrow from an X variable directly to Y, but also indirect effects, where one variable influences Y through another variable, which acts as a mediator. For instance, let's think about a car manufacturer. The mileage fuel efficiency of the car might directly impact its sales volume for buyers who are very eco-conscious. That's a direct effect. But maybe mileage also indirectly affects sales. How? Well, perhaps higher mileage often means a smaller engine, which might allow for less storage space in the car's design. And storage space, in turn, might negatively affect sales volume for families. So, mileage influences storage space, and storage space influences sales volume. That's an indirect path. The indirect effect would be calculated roughly by multiplying the coefficient from mileage to storage space by the coefficient from storage space to sales volume. The total effect of mileage on sales volume would then be the sum of its direct effect plus all of its indirect effects through mediators like storage space. This kind of analysis helps us understand the full causal structure, revealing these hidden pathways of influence and providing a much richer, more strategic understanding of how different factors really interact to drive the ultimate outcome we care about.
Wow, that's a huge leap. Going from just predicting a number to truly understanding the underlying mechanics and those complex, sometimes hidden causal relationships, that's powerful stuff. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about predicting what will happen using tools like logistic and linear regression. But what about actively trying to shape the future, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as how you price your products or services? I mean, that's a direct lever businesses can pull to influence revenue and profit, isn't it?
Absolutely. You've moved us perfectly into a crucial area of proactive business strategy, pricing. The fundamental relationship between the price you set for a product and the quantity consumers are actually willing to buy at that price is captured by the demand response curve. You can think of it as the blueprint of your market for that specific product. Now, every, let's say, valid demand curve generally have four essential properties economists talk about. First, demand must be non-negative. You can't have negative sales, right? Customers don't unbuy things. Second, the function should ideally be continuous and differentiable. That just means it's a smooth curve without sudden breaks or sharp, pointy corners, which allows for consistent mathematical analysis, like finding optima. And third, and most crucially, it must generally be downward sloping. This reflects that basic economic principle. As price goes up, the quantity demanded typically goes down. All else being equal, of course.
Okay, that downward slope makes perfect sense. Higher price, fewer buyers. But how do we actually measure how sensitive customers are to those price changes? I mean, does a Euro 1 change in price mean the same thing for, say, a pack of chewing gum as it does for a luxury car? It feels like the impact, the sensitivity, would be vastly different.
You're absolutely right. The impact varies wildly. And we have two primary ways to measure that price sensitivity: slope and elasticity. The slope of the demand curve, which is calculated as the change in demand divided by the change in price, tells us exactly how much demand changes in absolute units for a 1-unit change in price. For example, if the slope is negative 20, it means for every euro increase in price, demand drops by exactly 20 units, packs of gum, cars, whatever. However, the big limitation of slope is that its value is completely dependent on the units we use. If you measured price in pays instead of rupees, or if you measured demand in boxes instead of individual packs, the slope number would change drastically. This makes comparisons across different products or markets very difficult using slope alone. That's where elasticity, specifically price elasticity of demand, often denoted in EKI, comes in. It's a much more powerful concept for comparison. Elasticity is the ratio of the percentage change in demand to the percentage change in price. Because it uses percentages, it becomes unit independent. Doesn't matter if you're measuring price in dollars or yen or demand in kilograms or gallons. This makes elasticity far more useful for comparing price sensitivity across completely different products, industries, or even countries. It provides a standardized, universally interpretable measure. It allows us to definitively say this product's demand is much more sensitive to price changes than that one, regardless of their absolute price points or units of measurement.
Ah, okay. Percentage change versus absolute change. That clarifies it perfectly.
Yeah.
Elasticity sounds much more versatile. So what does elasticity look like in the real world? Does the source material give us some maybe surprising examples of what's elastic and what's inelastic?
Yes, the source provides some fascinating examples that really highlight the spectrum of sensitivity. And they often align with common sense, but sometimes reveal surprising nuances, especially when considering time horizons. For instance, it mentions the short-term elasticity for salt is basically zero, essentially perfectly inelastic. This means its demand barely budges with price changes, at least in the short run. People need salt, it's cheap, they're not going to buy significantly less just because the price goes up a little bit. It's a true necessity with few immediate substitutes. But then look at airline travel. The source says it's about zero point 0.1 in the short term. So relatively inelastic. If you need to book a last-minute flight for an emergency or urgent business trip, you'll pay what you have to. However, it becomes highly elastic, around 2.4 in the long term. Why? Because people plan vacations and non-urgent trips well in advance. If prices are too high, they'll simply wait for deals, choose alternative destinations, fly at off-peak times, or maybe even drive. They have many more options over a longer period. This really highlights the crucial time dimension of elasticity. Similarly, gasoline is estimated at zero point 0.2 short-term inelastic. We still need to fill up our tanks to get to work tomorrow, even if prices jump. Immediate substitutes are few, but it becomes a bit more elastic, around zero point 0.7 in the long term. Over months or years, people can adapt. They might buy more fuel-efficient cars, start carpooling, use public transport more, or even move closer to work. And for two-wheelers like motorcycles or scooters, the source gives an elasticity of 1.2.
Okay, so if we take that 1.2 for two-wheelers, what does that number practically tell a business that's trying to set prices for their scooters?
Right. And the elasticity of 1.2 means that if you were to reduce the price of your two-wheelers by, say, 10%, you could expect demand sales to increase by approximately 12%, 10% times 1.2. This leads directly to the crucial interpretations regarding total revenue, which is often the immediate concern for a business when considering price changes. If the absolute value of elasticity E is greater than 1, like our 1.2 for two-wheelers or 2.4 for long-term air travel, we say demand is elastic, consumers are highly sensitive to price changes. In this case, if you increase the price, total revenue will actually decrease, because the percentage drop in quantity demanded will be larger than the percentage increase in price. Conversely, if you decrease the price, total revenue will increase. Think of luxury goods, products with many close substitutes, or items that represent a large portion of a consumer's budget. These are markets where strategic price discounts can potentially significantly boost total revenue. If E is exactly equal to 1, we say demand is unit elastic. Here, the percentage change in quantity demanded exactly offsets the percentage change in price.
So changing the price, either up or down, doesn't affect total revenue at all. This is kind of a theoretical sweet spot, relatively rare in practice over a wide range of prices. If E is less than 1, like 0.1 for short-term air travel or 0 for salt, we say demand is inelastic. Consumers are relatively insensitive to price changes. In this case, if you increase the price, total revenue will increase because the percentage drop in quantity demanded will be smaller than the percentage increase in price. If you decrease the price, total revenue will actually decrease. This typically applies to necessities, products with few substitutes, addictive goods, or items that represent a very small fraction of a consumer's budget. For these products, price increases can potentially be a strong revenue driver, although there are always practical limits and considerations like fairness and long-term customer relationships.
Knowing those categories, elastic, inelastic, unit elastic, based on whether the number is bigger than, less than, or equal to 1, that seems incredibly helpful for thinking about basic pricing strategy and its impact on revenue. What kind of mathematical models do we typically use for these demand curves to actually put numbers to them and maybe forecast demand at different price points?
That's the next step, formalizing the relationship. We typically use two common types of mathematical models for demand curves, each with distinct properties and implications for pricing. First, there's the linear demand curve. It's represented by a simple linear equation, D/MP. Here, D is the demand at a given price. DRO is the market size or intercept that represents the theoretical maximum demand if the price were 0. You can think of it as how many people would want this product if it were given away for free. And M is the slope, a positive number representing how much demand drops for each 1 unit increase in price. A key concept associated with the linear curve is the satiating price, which is the price at which demand drops all the way to 0. You calculate it as P equals DMM. For example, if a product has a demand function d euro p equals 1520p, the C shading price is 1520.75. This tells us that theoretically, at a price of 75s or higher, absolutely no one would buy this product. Now, an important feature of the linear demand curve is that its elasticity actually varies along the curve. It's not constant.
Elasticity is 0 right at P will be 0, the intercept, and approaches infinity as the price gets very close to the satiating price. So in our DP oblivious 1520p example, we could calculate the elasticity at a specific price, say 50. Demand at P50 is 1500, 2050 equals 500. The formula for elasticity at a point is 9 MPDP. So here it's 9 at 20, 50, 500 is elastic 500 minus x2 equals 2. Since the elasticity 2 is greater than 1, this tells us that demand for this product is elastic at the price point of euro. The second common type is the constant elasticity curve. Its mathematical form is D equals Cp. Here, C is a scaling constant related to market size, P is the price, and E is the exponent, which directly represents the price elasticity of demand. As its name strongly implies, the key feature here is that the elasticity E remains constant at all price points along this curve. It doesn't change whether the price is high or low. This model has some interesting, though sometimes unrealistic, characteristics. For example, demand approaches infinity as the price approaches 0, and demand never actually reaches 0 at any finite price, unlike the linear curve. The implications for revenue are also quite stark with constant elasticity.
If demand is inelastic, meaning E1, then total revenue increases continuously as the price increases. There's theoretically no finite price that maximizes revenue, you just keep raising it, though again, practical limits apply. Conversely, if demand is elastic, meaning E1, then total revenue actually increases as the price decreases, meaning the theoretical revenue maximizing price approaches 0. This really highlights why understanding the type of demand curve you believe best represents your market is absolutely crucial before you start trying to optimize prices based on it. The strategies can be completely different.
Okay, these mathematical models, linear and constant elasticity, give us powerful ways to think about and quantify demand. But knowing the demand sensitivity, knowing the elasticity, that feels like just one piece of the puzzle. How do we actually use this knowledge to find the best price to charge? And maybe more importantly, should we always be aiming for maximum revenue, or is maximum profit the real goal? Because those aren't always the same thing, are they? Selling more units doesn't always mean making more money overall.
That's the absolute heart of price optimization. And you're exactly right. Revenue and profit are different, and optimizing for one often leads to a different price than optimizing for the other. The objective you choose, whether your primary goal is to maximize total revenue, perhaps to gain market share or hit sales targets, or to maximize total profit, focusing on the bottom line, fundamentally determines the optimal price you should set according to the model. They often lead to different strategic choices, each with its own business implications and trade-offs.
Okay, let's stick with that linear demand curve for a moment. DP, DOAMP. Walk us through how a business would go about finding the price that maximizes revenue using this model.
Certainly. So first we define the revenue function. Revenue is simply the price P multiplied by the quantity demanded at that price, DBR. DBR is P. So for our linear demand curve, the revenue function is RP, DROP. If we expand that out, we get RP or DBRO. This is a quadratic function, an upside-down parabola, which means it has a single peak and maximum point. To find the price P that corresponds to this peak revenue, we use a basic principle from calculus. We take the derivative of the revenue function R0 with respect to P, and we set that derivative equal to 0. The derivative tells us the slope, or the rate of change, of the revenue curve. Setting to D0 finds the point where the slope is flat at the very top of the curve. When you do that math, the derivative of d(m) with respect to P is d(0). Setting it to 0, d(2b) is 0, and solving for P gives us the optimal revenue maximizing price. P equals d(2). Let's use that example from the source again. If the demand is d(0), if the demand is d(0) equals 5842.157.7 P. Here, d(0) equals 58ham.47.8 and m 157.7. The optimal revenue price P would be 5842.257.7. That calculates to 5842.8350.4, which is approximately 18.52.
This is the exact price point where, according to this model, total revenue would be highest. Any small change in price, either up or down from 18.52, would cause total revenue to decrease slightly.
Okay, 18.52 for maximum revenue. That gives us the revenue sweet spot. But as you mentioned, businesses ultimately live and die by profit, not just revenue. Revenue is often called vanity. Profit is sanity, right? So what about profit maximization? That feels like the more fundamental goal for most companies. How do we find that price?
It absolutely is the primary goal for most commercial enterprises. So to find the profit maximizing price, we need to introduce the cost side of the equation. Specifically, we usually consider the marginal cost C, which is the cost to produce one additional unit of the product. For simplicity in these models, we often assume it's constant, Profit, usually denoted by SLP, is calculated as the profit per unit, which is price cost, multiplied by the number of units sold, demand to sold to PC. Using our linear demand curve, this becomes SOP D arrow MP. If we expand this, we get SAO, SPD arrow, A arrow, SCC, NCT, and plus MCP. Again, this is a quadratic function, an upside-down parabola, so it has a maximum point. We apply the exact same calculus principle. Take the derivative of the profit function for BP with respect to P and set it equal to 0 to find the peak. When you work through the math, the derivative is D arrow 2 meter P plus MC. Setting it to 0 and solving for P gives us the optimal profit maximizing price, P D arrow plus MC. 2 meter. Let's use our previous example again. DOE at 42.8, 157.7 P. Let's assume the marginal cost C is 15. Then the optimal profit price P is 42.8 plus 157.7, 57.15 or 2 and 57.7.
The numerator becomes 5842.8 plus 2365.5, which is A2 below 8.3. The denominator is 315.4. So P equals 82 below 8.3, 315.4, which calculates to approximately 26.02.
Wow, okay. 26.02 for maximum profit versus 18.52 for maximum revenue. That's a pretty significant difference in this example. So is it generally true that the profit maximizing price will always be higher than the revenue maximizing price, assuming there's a positive marginal cost?
Yes, that's a key and very intuitive observation. As long as the marginal cost C is positive, which almost always is in reality, the profit maximizing price will always be higher than the revenue maximizing price for these standard downward sloping demand curves. The reason is pretty simple when you think about it. To maximize revenue, you're primarily focused on selling as much total value, price times quantity, as possible, even if the last few units sold don't add much to your profit margin. But to maximize profit, you're looking to maximize the value after accounting for the cost of producing each unit. You're willing to sacrifice some sales volume by charging a higher price in order to ensure that each unit you do sell contributes more significantly to your bottom line. You stop increasing quantity when the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, which happens at a lower quantity and thus higher price than the point where marginal revenue hits 0, which is the revenue max point. It's a fundamental trade-off that businesses constantly navigate. And notice how the formulas show that market size, DRO, the demand slope, M, and importantly, the marginal cost, C, all directly influence these optimal prices. This makes these formulas really powerful tools, not just for finding one number, but for sensitivity analysis and strategic scenario planning. What if our costs go up? What if the market shrinks? How should our optimal price change? Now, just quickly, for those constant elasticity curves, DOLC, PO, the pricing strategies for optimization are quite different due to their unique mathematical properties. As we touched on before, if demand is inelastic, meaning E1, revenue just keeps increasing as price increases. So there's no finite revenue maximizing price according to the pure model. You'd theoretically keep raising the price. If demand is elastic, E1, revenue increases as price decreases, so the theoretical revenue maximizing price actually approaches 0. However, even if revenue maximization is tricky, there is a well-defined profit maximizing price for the elastic case, E1. It's calculated as P, E1, where A is the elasticity, E, and C is the marginal cost. The formula is only valid if E1, though. If demand is inelastic for a constant elasticity curve, the profit maximizing price is also theoretically infinite. This again just underscores the fundamental differences between these two common demand curve types and why understanding which model might better fit your situation is so critical before you jump into optimization calculations.
Right. These mathematical models are clearly incredibly powerful. They give you a precise data-driven starting point for your pricing strategy. But surely in the real world, you can't just plug numbers into a formula, get a price like 26.02 and, just run with it without thinking any further. There must be more to it than just the pure math.
Oh, absolutely not. You'd be foolish to do that. The mathematical optimum is a vital, data-driven baseline. It gives you a really strong anchor point grounded in your demand and cost structure. But it's very rarely the sole determinant of a successful, sustainable pricing strategy. You must always consider a whole host of practical considerations. These are often qualitative or strategic factors that the simple mathematical models don't capture. For instance, a huge one is, how will your competitors react if you suddenly change your price to 26.02? A price cut might trigger a devastating price war that ends up eroding everyone's profits, including yours. A price hike might invite competitors to undercut you and steal market share. You have to anticipate those competitive dynamics. What about customer psychology? Does pricing at, say, $999 versus $1,000 have irrational but very real impact on perceived value and sales? We see this charm pricing everywhere, suggesting it works even if the difference is tiny. The pure math won't tell you that. You also absolutely need to consider different market segments. Do all your customers have the same sensitivity to price? Probably not. You might need segmented pricing strategies. maybe a premium version with extra features at a higher price for less sensitive customers, and a basic, lower-priced version for more price-sensitive segments. The single optimal price from the model might miss these opportunities. And crucially, think about the long-term impact on your brand perception and customer loyalty. Slashing prices aggressively to hit the revenue-maximizing points might boost short-term sales, but could it permanently erode your brand's value, making your product seem cheap or low quality in the long run? Conversely, setting the price too high, even if it's the profit-maximizing point on paper, might alienate loyal customers or make your product seem completely unattainable for your core target market, hurting long-term growth. These qualitative factors, the competitive intelligence, the brand strategy, the potential for cannibalization across your own product line, and just general strategic foresight. They must all be integrated with the insights from the mathematical optimization to craft a truly robust, defensible, and sustainable pricing strategy. It's definitely an art informed by science.
That's a really crucial distinction. The math gives you a starting point, but strategy and market knowledge complete the picture. Okay, we've covered predicting outcomes and optimizing prices, both incredibly valuable. What about another common business challenge? You have limited resources, maybe a fixed budget, only so much raw material available, or a finite amount of machine time on the factory floor. How do you allocate those scarce resources across different activities or products to achieve the best possible overall outcome? This feels like a core challenge for almost any organization, whether it's a giant manufacturing plant or even just a small service team. It's about doing more with less, right?
Precisely. And this falls squarely under the broad and vital field of operations research, OR. OR is a discipline focused on using advanced analytical methods to help make better and specifically optimal decisions in complex situations, particularly those involving resource allocation under constraints. A core, and perhaps the most famous technique within OR, is linear programming, LP. LP is an incredibly powerful mathematical method specifically designed to find the best possible outcome, whether that's maximizing profit, maximizing production throughput, minimizing cost, minimizing waste. Whatever your goal is subject to a set of constraints representing your limitations. The key condition, the reason it's called linear programming, is that all the relationships involved, both in the objective you're trying to achieve and in the constraints you're operating under, must be linear. No exponents, no multiplying variables together, just straight-line relationships. This linearity assumption simplifies the problem significantly, allowing for very robust mathematical techniques that can guarantee finding the globally optimal solution efficiently, even for very large and complex problems.
Okay, linear relationships are key. So if I wanted to actually set up an LP problem to figure out, say, my best production mix, what are the basic building blocks I need to define first? What elements make up a typical linear program?
Right. Every LP problem, no matter how simple or complex, has four main components that you need to clearly define to formulate it correctly. First, you have the decision variables. These are the unknown quantities that the LP model needs to determine for you. They represent the choices you can make. In a manufacturing setting, for example, they would typically be the number of units of each different product to produce. Let's call them X euro, X eschweiss, etc. Second, you need a clear objective function. This is the single quantifiable goal that you want to achieve, expressed as a linear function of your decision variables. For example, it might be maximize total revenue from selling the products, or minimize total cost of a logistics operation, or perhaps maximize the nutritional value of a feed mix subject to ingredient costs. It's a single metric you're trying to push as high or as low as possible. Third, and absolutely crucial, are the constraints. These represent the limitations or requirements you face based on things like available resources, budget, materials, labor hours, machine capacity, production capabilities, minimum demand levels you have to meet, or even regulatory requirements. These constraints must also be expressed as linear functions of the decision variables. They typically take the form of less than or equal to, like budget limits or raw material availability, greater than or equal to, like minimum production quotas or required quality levels, or sometimes equal to, like needing to fulfill an exact order quantity. They define the feasible region, the set of all possible solutions that are actually achievable given your limitations. And finally, although sometimes considered part of the constraints, we usually explicitly state the non-negativity restrictions. Our decision variables generally cannot be negative. You can't produce a negative number of cars or assign negative employees to a task. So we typically add constraints like X0 air, X00, and so on for all decision variables.
Okay, decision variables, objective function, constraints, and non-negativity. Got it. Can you give us a quick, concrete example of how this would be applied in a business scenario? Maybe using that automobile manufacturer example from the outline again.
Certainly, that's a classic application. Let's imagine that automobile manufacturer produces three types of cars: hatchbacks, sedans, and SUVs. Each car type has a different profit margin, or selling price if we're maximizing revenue, and requires different amounts of two critical limited resource, let's say, hours of assembly line time, resource A, and units of specialized parts, resource B, for manufacturing. Our decision variables would be X years, X euros, and X euros, representing the number of hatchbacks, sedans, and SUVs, respectively, to reduce in the upcoming planning period. You'll see next week. These are the numbers the LP model will figure out for us. The objective function would likely be to maximize total revenue or profit. So if a hatchback sells for $500,000, a sedan for $1 million, and an SUV for $500,000, our objective would be stated mathematically as maximize 500,000 X euros plus 1 million euros plus 2,500,000 euros. The constraints would be based on our limited resources. For example, let's say a hatchback needs 15 hours of assembly time, resource A, a sedan needs 20 hours, and an SUV needs 60 hours. And suppose we only have a total of 120,000 hours of assembly time available next week.
Our first constraint would be 15x plus 20x euros plus 60x euros, 120,000. Similarly, for specialized parts, resource B, maybe a hatchback needs 20 parts, a sedan 50, and an SUV 100. And let's say we only have 140,000 of these parts available. That gives us our second constraint, 20x plus 50 euros plus 100x euros, 140,000. And finally, we have our non-negativity constraints, x euro, x zero, x euro, 0. Once you've formulated the problem like this, you feed it into an LP solver software, which uses sophisticated algorithms like the simplex method to find the exact values of x euros and x that achieve the highest possible revenue while satisfying all the constraints simultaneously. It's like having a super smart production planner that finds the absolute best possible plan given your limitations.
Okay, so LP helps us find that optimal production plan, the best mix of X's. But I remember reading in the outline about something called duality. It sounds like it gives us even deeper insights beyond just the optimal production numbers. Like it reveals the hidden values of our resources. That could be incredibly useful for making decisions about, say, whether to invest in more machine time or buy more raw materials.
It absolutely is. Duality in linear programming is a fascinating and incredibly insightful concept. It often reveals the true economic value hidden within your constraints. The basic idea is that every linear programming problem, which we call the primal problem, like the maximization problem we just set up, has an associated dual problem. And the beauty is that these primal and dual problems are intrinsically linked in a very elegant way. For example, the number of decision variables in the dual problem is exactly equal to the number of constraints in the primal problem, and vice versa. Also, the objective function coefficients for the primal problem, our selling prices, become the right-hand side values of the constraints in the dual problem, and the right-hand side values of the primal constraints, our resource availabilities, become the coefficients in the objective function of the dual. It's like looking at the exact same problem, but from a completely different yet perfectly complementary perspective, often the perspective of the resources rather than the products.
Okay, that's interesting how they mirror each other. But what's the practical economic interpretation here? What do these dual variables actually represent for a business manager?
This is where it gets really powerful. The optimal values of the decision variables in the dual problem represent the shadow prices, also sometimes called marginal values or dual values, of the resources corresponding to the constraints in the primal problem. What does that mean? A shadow price tells you exactly how much your optimal objective function value, for example, your maximum total profit or maximum total revenue, would change if you had one more unit of that particular constrained resource, assuming all other conditions remain the same. So if the shadow price associated with the assembly line time constraint, resource A, in our car example turns out to be, say, $5,000, it means that acquiring one additional hour of assembly time would allow you to increase your company's total maximum profit by $5,000 by adjusting the production mix optimally. This is crucial information. It tells you exactly what your true bottlenecks are, the resources that are really holding back your objective. And it tells you the maximum amount you should be willing to pay to acquire one more unit of that scarce resource. If you can get more assembly time for less than $5,000 per hour, you should definitely do it. It quantifies the value of relieving your constraints.
That's incredibly useful. Knowing the shadow price tells you exactly where to focus improvement efforts or where potential investments would have the biggest payoff. Now, there is also this term complementary slackness. It sounds important for understanding how the primal solution, the X's, and the dual solution, the shadow prices, relate to each other. It seems to connect directly to those shadow prices and tell us which constraints are really biting.
It is absolutely fundamental, yes. The complementary slackness theorem states some key principles that elegantly link the optimal solutions of the primal and the dual problems. It provides direct managerial insights into how your resources are being used. Simply put, the core ideas are: if a primal constraint is non-binding at the optimal solution, meaning you have slack or leftover resource, you didn't use all of your available assembly time, for example, then its corresponding dual variable, the shadow price for assembly time, must be zero. This makes perfect sense, right? If that resource isn't fully utilized, it's not currently a bottleneck. Having a little bit more of it wouldn't immediately allow you to increase your objective value because you're not even using up what you already have. So its marginal value is zero. It's not holding you back at this moment. Conversely, if a primal constraint is binding at the optimum, meaning it's fully utilized, you used up every single hour of assembly time available, then its corresponding dual variable, shadow price, will be positive. This indicates that the resource does have positive marginal value. It is currently limiting your objective function.
Getting more of this resource will allow you to improve your outcome. These binding constraints are where your leverage points are. Let's consider that investment portfolio example from the sources. An investor has a constraint saying they can invest no more than $50,000 in the steel industry. Suppose the optimal LP solution tells them to only allocate $40,000 to steel investments to maximize their overall return. In this case, that steel industry investment constraint is non-binding. They have 10,000 euros of slack euro, 50,000 euro, 40,000 euro. According to complementary slackness, the dual variable, shadow price, corresponding to that specific euro 50,000 steel constraint must be zero. What does this tell the investor? It tells them that, at least within a certain range, tightening or loosening that specific euro 50,000 DR limit for steel won't actually impact their overall optimal portfolio return. Why? Because they aren't even hitting that limit anyway with their current optimal strategy. This principle beautifully pinpoints which constraints are truly critical bottlenecks, the ones with positive shadow prices because they're binding, and which ones currently have scare capacity, zero shadow price, non-binding. It helps managers focus their attention and resources where they matter most.
Okay, LP with duality and complementary slackness gives us a really powerful way to optimize when we have clear inputs, outputs, and linear relationships, like in manufacturing or logistics. But what if we're dealing with situations that are a bit fuzzier, like running service units, think bank branches, or hospital departments, or maybe even different university departments within a college? How do we compare their efficiency when they often use multiple inputs, like staff numbers, budget allocation, floor space, and produce multiple, sometimes intangible outputs, like number of loans, processed, custom satisfaction scores, patient recovery rates, number of students graduated, research papers published? Just doing a simple output divided by input ratio probably isn't fair or informative enough when you have all that complexity in multiple dimensions, right?
That's precisely the kind of complex, multidimensional efficiency measurement challenge that data development analysis, DEA, was specifically developed to address. It's a really powerful, non-parametric mathematical programming method. It's used to measure the relative efficiency of a set of comparable organizational units. It's not trying to find some absolute measure of perfection, but rather trying to identify who among a peer group is doing the absolute best job of converting their inputs into outputs, given the technology or process demonstrated by the entire group. And importantly, it doesn't just give a score. It also helps identify specific best practices from the top performers and, crucially, can set concrete, achievable targets for improvement for the units identified as inefficient. It offers a clear pathway towards operational excellence based on observed best performance within the group.
Okay, so DEA helps figure out who's relatively efficient among a group of comparable units. It's almost like finding the valedictorians in a class, even when there are multiple subjects or criteria involved.
Yes, that's a pretty good analogy. DEA identifies what's called the efficiency frontier. This frontier is made up of a set of best-in-class decision-making units, DMUs, that are operating optimally relative to their peers in the dataset. A DMU is just any entity that converts inputs into outputs. It could be a bank branch, a hospital ward, a sales team, a school, anything you want to compare. For a fair comparison, though, the DMUs included in the analysis should be performing similar activities with similar objectives, using similar kinds of inputs to produce similar kinds of outputs. You want to compare apples to apples as much as possible. The DMUs on the efficiency frontier are assigned an efficiency score of 1 or 100%. All other units, the ones not on the frontier, are then measured relative to this frontier. They're deemed inefficient, with scores less than 1, if they are enveloped by the efficient units. What does enveloped mean? It means that theoretically, a combination of one or more efficient units on the frontier could produce at least the same outputs as the inefficient unit, but using strictly less of at least one input and no more of any other input. Or, alternatively, using the same inputs, That combination could produce strictly more of at least one output, and no less of any other. DEA essentially constructs this best practice boundary based on the observed performance of the units in the sample, and then measures how far away the less efficient units are from reaching that boundary.
Let's try to make that more concrete with the sales offices example from the sources. If we just had a super simple case, 5 sales offices, 1 input, investment euro, 1 output, sales euro. If we calculate sales per euro invested for each, and Office 5 has the highest ratio at the 13.00, then in this simple case, Office 5 sets the efficiency frontier, score equals 1. All the other offices with lower ratios would be considered inefficient compared to Office 5. That seems straightforward enough.
All right, that's the simplest possible case, a single input and a single output. DEA's real power comes when it gets more complex. Now imagine the scenario from the source with 2 inputs, say budget allocated and team size, number of salespeople, both used to achieve a single output, maybe a specific sales target. DEA would now look for the offices that achieve that target using the least combined amount of budget and team size. It finds the minimal resource performers. The analysis might find that, say, offices 2, 3, and 5 are on this multidimensional frontier, score S1. They represent different, equally valid ways to be efficient. Maybe Office 2 uses a small budget but a larger team, while Office 5 uses a larger budget but a very small, highly productive team. Office 1 and 4, however, might be found to be inefficient. Score 1. This means they're using too much budget or too large a team size, or maybe both, relative to what the best performers like 2, 3, and 5 demonstrate is possible to achieve the same sales target. Or consider the other multidimensional example. 1 input, say just budget, but 2 outputs, say total sales generated and number of new leads generated. Now, DEA would identify the offices that produce the most combined output, sales and leads, for a given level of budget. It finds the maximal output performers. Perhaps offices 3, 4, and 5 turn out to be on this output-oriented frontier. This would indicate that offices 1 and 2 are inefficient in their output generation. For the budget they have, they aren't producing as much sales or as many leads as their top-performing peers show is achievable. This ability to handle multiple inputs and multiple outputs simultaneously, without needing to pre-assign weights or create a single ratio, is really where DEA excels and why it's so valuable for assessing complex service operations where those simple ratios just fall short.
Okay, I see. It handles the complexity. But what sounds really powerful about DEA, based on the description, is not just finding out who is inefficient, but giving them concrete advice on how they can actually get better. It offers specific, actionable advice, doesn't it? It's not just a grade on a report card. It sounds more like a personalized roadmap for improvement.
Absolutely. That's arguably the most valuable output of a DEA analysis for managers. For each inefficient DMU, DEA identifies a hypothetical composite unit, HTCU. This HCU lies on the efficiency frontier and serves as a tangible, achievable target for the inefficient unit. Now, this HCU isn't usually a real single unit. Instead, it's typically constructed as a weighted average or linear combination of one or more of the actual efficient DMUs on the frontier. These efficient units that contribute to forming the target for an inefficient unit are called its reference units or its peer group. They represent the specific role models that the inefficient unit should try to emulate. Based on this HCU target, we can then choose one of 2 orientations for improvement. An input-oriented approach asks, how much could this inefficient unit reduce its inputs while still producing its current level of outputs? The goal is resource conservation. An output-oriented approach asks, how much could this inefficient unit increase its outputs if it continued to use its current level of inputs? The goal is output augmentation. This provides highly specific, data-driven pathways to improvement, tailored to the individual inefficient unit's situation and benchmarked against its best-performing peers.
Could you give an example of this kind of prescriptive insight? Because that seems like where the rubber really meets the road for a manager trying to actually improve their team's or branch's performance.
Certainly. Let's go back to Sales Office 1, which we found might be inefficient. Suppose the DEA analysis identifies efficient offices 2 and 5 as its primary reference units, its peer group. If we run an input-oriented DEA model, the results might reveal something very specific like, to become efficient, Sales Office 1 should aim to reduce its operating budget by 62,460 run and reduce its team size by 2.7 people while still maintaining its current levels of sales and lead generation. Notice how specific that is. It's not just a vague suggestion to cut costs or be more efficient. It provides concrete, quantifiable targets for input reduction, based directly on what its efficient peers, Offices 2 and 5, are achieving. Conversely, if we ran an output-oriented model for Office 1, the results might say something like, To become efficient, Sales Office 1 needs to increase its total sales by 516,094 and generate 6.97 more qualified leads using its current budget and team size. Again, it provides specific measurable targets for output increases benchmarked against what its peers demonstrate is possible with similar resources. This kind of specific data-backed guidance is absolutely invaluable for managers. It helps them set realistic performance goals, justify resource reallocations if needed, identify specific areas for process improvement by studying the reference units, and ultimately drive performance improvements without resorting to guesswork or arbitrary targets pulled out of thin air.
That prescriptive element makes it sound incredibly useful. So, summing up, what's the big picture advantage of using DEA? And maybe, what are some limitations or things we should be aware of when interpreting the results? No analytical tool is perfect, after all.
You're right. It's important to understand both sides. The advantages of DEA are quite significant. As we've discussed, it easily handles multiple inputs and multiple outputs simultaneously, often measured in different units, which is crucial for complex operations. Crucially, it's non-parametric, meaning it makes no assumptions about the underlying functional relationship between inputs and outputs. Unlike regression, which often assumes linearity or some other specific form, DEA just looks at the data as it is. It provides direct comparisons and relative efficiency rankings among peer units. It clearly identifies best practices by highlighting the efficient units on the frontier and their input-output combinations. As we just saw, it offers prescriptive insights and specific targets for improvement for inefficient units, identifying their relevant peer group. And it's flexible, allowing management to choose between an input or output orientation based on their strategic priorities. However, DEA does have limitations that are important to keep in mind. It measures relative efficiency only. A unit deemed efficient by DEA is only efficient relative to the other units included in that specific analysis.
It doesn't mean it's efficient in some absolute sense or that it couldn't be improved further if compared to a wider set or an external benchmark. It can be quite sensitive to outliers. A single unit with extremely high performance or extremely low input usage can significantly shape the efficiency frontier and potentially make many other units appear inefficient by comparison. Careful data screening is important. DEA is typically deterministic. It assumes that any deviation from the efficiency frontier is purely due to inefficiency. It doesn't explicitly account for random error, measurement noise, or just plain bad luck that might temporarily impact a unit's measured performance. So results should be interpreted with some domain knowledge and consideration of potential external factors. And a key underlying assumption is that all the DMUs included in the analysis must be truly comparable, performing similar tasks, operating under broadly similar conditions, and facing similar environmental constraints. If you compare apples and oranges, the results won't be very meaningful.
Okay, understanding those strengths and weaknesses is key. So, given those advantages, where can we actually see DEA being used today? Where is it making a real-world difference in how organizations operate?
It's actually very widely applied across a whole range of sectors, especially those that operate with multiple comparable service or production units. You'll find it used extensively in banking for comparing the performance of different branches, identifying inefficient outlets, and helping them reallocate resources or implement best practices learned from the top-performing branches. In healthcare, it's frequently used for evaluating the efficiency of hospital departments, entire hospitals, or even regional healthcare systems based on inputs like beds, staff, budget, and outputs like patient throughput, recovery rates, or quality metrics. It helps find ways to improve care delivery within budget constraints. In education, it's used to assess the efficiency of schools or university departments based on inputs like funding and faculty numbers, and outputs like student test scores, graduation rates, or research publications. In transportation, you might see it used to analyze the operational efficiency of different airline routes, airports, or even public transit systems. And even in the public sector, it's used for assessing the performance of different government agencies or service centers in delivering services effectively with their allocated budgets. Basically, anywhere you have a network of similar units that are using various resources to produce multiple types of results, DEA can provide powerful insights into their relative operational excellence and highlight specific areas for targeted improvement efforts.
Wow, what a comprehensive journey we've been on. We started with predicting those yes-no outcomes using logistic regression and understanding its metrics like precision and recall. Then we moved to predicting continuous numbers with multiple linear regression, learning about R-squared, multicollinearity, and even path analysis. Then we shifted gears completely into pricing strategy, understanding demand curves, the crucial concept of elasticity, and how to optimize price for either revenue or profit. And finally, we dove deep into optimal resource allocation using linear programming, uncovering the value of shadow prices with duality, and measuring complex efficiency with data envelopment analysis. It really feels like we've covered a huge chunk of the analytical toolkit needed to navigate the modern business landscape effectively.
Indeed. And I hope what came across is that these aren't just, dry mathematical formulas you memorize from a textbook. They are truly sophisticated frameworks for critical thinking. They help you ask better, more precise questions about your data, about your operations, about your market. And ultimately, they help drive truly data-driven decisions that can genuinely make or break a business in today's world. The real value isn't just in the ability to crunch the numbers, although that's important. It's in the clarity they bring, the strategic insights they unlock, and the concrete, actionable recommendations they can provide in the face of all the complexity and competition out there. They really empower you to move from just observing your data to actively extracting tangible value and finding that competitive edge.
So, thinking about our listeners, what does this all mean for you, the learner, tuning in today? Well, it means you now have a much more powerful mental toolkit for approaching all sorts of business problems with more confidence. You're better equipped to ask those insightful questions when someone presents data or a proposal. You can better understand the analytical outputs that likely cross your desk or appear in reports. And maybe, just maybe, you're even better equipped to challenge some of the underlying assumptions that drive decisions in modern organizations. This deep dive has hopefully equipped you to see those hidden patterns, those leverage points, those potential optimizations in almost any business scenario you encounter, empowering you to contribute more strategically, whatever your role.
Exactly. And maybe a good way to solidify this is, as you go about your day today or this week, try to actively consider a recent business decision you've observed or perhaps even been a part of. Maybe it was setting the price for a new product launch or a decision about how to allocate resources within your team, or maybe even just a performance evaluation discussion about a particular department or project. Now think back. How might one of these analytical tools we discussed, maybe constructing a careful confusion matrix to guide a marketing campaign target, or running an optimal price calculation for that new service, or perhaps performing an efficiency analysis of your team's different processes? How might that have potentially changed the outcome, or at least provided a deeper, more nuanced, more data-informed understanding of the situation before the decision was made? The real power comes now in starting to connect these concepts to the real world around you. That allows you to move beyond simply receiving information, like you did today, to truly understanding, applying, and leveraging this knowledge in a meaningful way in your own context.
That's a great final thought. Connecting the concepts to the real world is where the magic happens. Well, that's all the time we have for this particular deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us. And we certainly look forward to the next time we can help you make sense of another complex and fascinating topic.